Thank you. Thank you so much, Radhika. Thank you for convening this talk, which I think is hugely important because there's a tectonic and civilizational struggle taking place over the meaning of Victory Day. And I think that struggle is as much about the past as it is about the future. And I'll say a little bit more about that later. You know, the West, basically since the end of the war, has been engaged in what might be the most consequential campaigns of revisionism ever undertaken. You know, it's turned completely on its head notions that were common sense, even in the West at the end of the war. If you look at polling that was carried out in France in 1945, the vast majority of people recognized the singular contribution of the Soviet Union to victory. And if you look at more recent polling today, that has completely flipped, with the United States taking the dominant role in the Soviet Union being recognized as a minor contributor. So it's reversed basically parts of that historical narrative, and the primary story that's being told is, of course, about the role of the Soviet Union defeating Germany, but it's not the only part of the kind of campaign of revisionism, and I'll say more about that later. Now, among comrades, we know about the contribution of the Red Army. It defeated over 600 German divisions, which is multiples what was defeated by the rest of the Allied powers. It eliminated 3/4 of German military equipment. It killed 3 million German soldiers, 4 million were captured, 3 million, 4 million were wounded, 3 million were captured. Auschwitz was liberated by the Red Army. Berlin was taken by the Red Army. And there's this kind of pernicious narrative that the Soviet Union was unprepared, which really collapses when you go back into the documents of the Soviet leadership from the 1930s. You know, you read, I think it was the 1934, the 17th Party Congress in 1934, where Stalin says explicitly that another imperialist war is on the horizon, and it is going to be led by Germany, and it is going to be primarily an assault on the Soviet Union. And in fact, you can consider the entire imperative, the entire impulse for industrialization that took place at that time with the 5-year plans as being part of a process to develop defensive capacities within the state to protect against an existential war from imperialism, which was very clear would come at some point. And if you read the diaries, it's very interesting to look at the diaries of the Nazi leadership from the start of Operation Barbarossa, the start of the invasion. You really see that those strategies bore fruit. You know, Joseph Goebbels writes in September 1941, he says, "We calculated the potential of the Bolsheviks in a completely erroneous way." This was about 2 months after the start of the invasion, 3 months. In November, later that year, Hitler says, "How can such a primitive people manage such technical achievements in such a short time?" And this was, of course, in response to the reports that were coming in from the front, where German troops had discovered massive Soviet steelworks. They discovered extensive networks of railway lines that hadn't featured on German maps. They were stunned. But we also know that the Soviet Union bore the overwhelming brunt of that war. You know, Hitler considered the Slavic people, just like the Jews, the Roma, the Sinti, and the other oppressed groups, as a subhuman category. And Hitler said explicitly that the war on the Eastern Front would not be the same as the war on the Western Front. It would be a war of annihilation. It would be a war waged through genocide. And we can see that, you know, look at the prisoner of war camps. You have reports from the diaries of prisoners of war from the Western Allied powers, the United States, from Britain, who were separated by a fence from Soviet troops, who were held in conditions which were no different from those of the extermination camps and the other concentration camps around Europe. 3 million Soviet prisoners of war were killed in German camps through starvation, through exposure, through forced labor, through summary executions. In Leningrad, you had a siege, lasted almost 900 days, and claimed about 1.5 million people, which was, I think, a little over 1,000 per day. And it was more loss of human life than the combined wartime death toll suffered by Britain and the United States, right, in a single city in the Soviet Union. The Germans, through brutal methods exterminated roughly a quarter of the population of Belarus, and in total 27 million people were killed by the Germans. And that memory is being attacked now. And so I want to focus on three particular lines of attack, on three forms of revisionism that we see taking place across the West. And the first is the attempt to sever Nazism from its colonial roots, to pretend that what Hitler did in Eastern Europe is not what the European powers had done throughout Asia, throughout Africa, throughout the Americas for many centuries. And in fact, Germany refuses to admit this, but we know that Germany itself was responsible for the first genocide in the 20th century against the Herero and Nama people in modern-day Namibia. And it was there, in fact, that the very first use of the term concentration camp was recorded in official German documents. And these were camps in which the colonized were subject to torture, to starvation, to slave labor, to medical experimentation, and of course to extermination, a direct blueprint and predecessor of what came after. And Hitler was deeply inspired by that legacy, of course, not only by the legacies of the maritime colonial powers of Britain and Belgium and Spain and France and so on, but in particular of the settler colonial project in North America. He said he admired how the United States had managed to exterminate its native people, and how it managed to keep the remainder locked in a, he said, kept in a cage. He admired the very strict regime of racial segregation that the US had implemented. There's a great book called Hitler's American Model, which looks in a lot of detail at how the Nuremberg race laws were directly based on the Jim Crow regime in the United States. And German scholars, German jurists spent extensive time in the United States studying those laws and planning for their application back in Germany. And other German officials were explicit about their intentions. Hermann Göring said that in the interests of the German economy, all the newly occupied territories on the Eastern Front will be treated as colonies and will be exploited using colonial methods. This was an order. And so the German war on the Eastern Front, like the Japanese war in China, was very clearly part of the broader European colonial tradition. It brought the strategies and technologies that had been honed in the colonies, in the peripheries, back to the old continent. There's another dimension here which I think is relevant about colonialism and the war, because it was the very fact of the existence of colonialism that made what was fundamentally a European war into a world war, right? The rest of the world wouldn't have been dragged into either side in the war if it was not for the fact of the subjugation of the peoples of India, of Africa, of Asia, and to some extent also, to a lesser extent also Latin America, because it was less involved in direct fighting. But it was the war that brought starvation to Bengal in the 1940s. Direct British policy that killed 3-4 million people at that time. So that's one instrument of one tool, one vector of revisionism, the attempt to sever Nazism from its colonial roots. The second is the attempt to disconnect fascism from its capitalist roots. And if you look at the German economy, in fact, both in World War I and World War II, you see that the underlying motor force was a profound crisis of profitability. Germany, unlike the other European colonial powers, was late to the scramble for colonies. It didn't have many colonial possessions, but it had a very developed and advanced industry that was growing and that needed an outlet. And that outlet couldn't be satisfied domestically, in particular after the conditions imposed on Germany after World War I. So it needed to seek an outlet. It needed to seek an outlet for its investment, it needed to seek new markets, it needed to seek new resources, it needed to seek new labor. And if you look at the promise of Lebensraum, of living space for the German people, it wasn't just that German settlers would acquire land in the East to live on. It was really a promise of those markets, resources, and labor for German monopolies. And so for Germany, maybe to attempt an answer to Alex's question about what fascism is, war was a strategy fundamentally of primitive accumulation, and fascism was its organizing ideology, which helped secure by force the organization of the entirety of German society for violence. And this is where we come to the third and I think the most consequential strategy of revisionism here, the most consequential battleground, which is the attempt to equate communism with fascism. In fact, this in my native Poland, this form of revisionism is basically mandated by law. There's legislation that puts fascism and communism on equal footing. But if we look at the Soviet economy and compare it to the Nazi economy, it was a fundamentally different orientation. It was an economy that sought to direct its productive forces towards development, towards literacy, towards education, towards healthcare. And the entire state building project was directed at dismantling the divisions of class, at weakening the tensions of ethnicity, of nation within what we might call today a plurinational state. And the Soviet people, having seized that state, were now the subjects of its history, and they carried with them a very different subjectivity into war. And you can that really comes across when you read the diaries of German soldiers and compare them with the diaries of Soviet soldiers. There's a dignity, there's a heroism, there's a purpose to the Soviet struggle that is entirely lacking in the German army. And so I said at the start that I think this is as much a battle as about the past as it is about the future. And I think that's the case because the battle to erase Nazism, in particular Nazism's colonial inheritance, has, in a sense, as Radika was saying at the beginning, freed the rest of the Western world, the colonial world, from the burden of its own past. Now, if Nazism was the singular crime, and in some countries that position is now legally mandated, in Germany, Holocaust exceptionalism is, written into legislation again, then it stands apart from the extermination of the Native Americans, the genocide in Belgian Congo, the many genocides in British India, and so on and so forth. And that removal of Nazism from its own history has allowed that history to carry on, largely uncontested in the West. Right? You look at France and Algeria. After World War II, France was operating concentration camps for Algerian revolutionaries, and not only, several million were killed. The US and Korea, a quarter of the population killed in a bombing campaign that destroyed nearly every building in the country in the north. You look at the British in Kenya, you look at the US again in Indonesia and Vietnam and Guatemala, you look at Palestine today. Every one of these was a brutal assault by imperialism, backed by the repression of opposition forces back in the metropoles, back in the US and in Western Europe, that served the agenda of imperialist accumulation. Maybe one more point I'd like to make, which I think we haven't adequately contended with, which is a point that Radika made at the beginning, and that is the absorption of fascism, the direct absorption of fascism into NATO. Not only the absorption of fascism's fundamental anti-communist mission, but also the absorption of individuals. What does it mean that Hitler's chief of staff became the chairman of NATO's military committee? What does it mean that Erwin Rommel's chief of staff became the commander-in-chief of NATO forces in Central Europe? Or there's a whole list of Nazi figures who joined very high positions within NATO, but also within the US security apparatus after the war. And the effects are very plain to see. NATO has repeatedly repurposed fascism in a war against socialism, in the purpose of socialist containment. From the very beginning, in Italy, we had seen the massive support of reactionary right-wing forces who waged a long-standing and clandestine war against communists, who were hugely popular on the back of the victory in the Second World War. You see NATO's support of Portugal, which was a founding member under a fascist dictatorship, but in particular NATO's support of Portugal's colonial wars in Africa. And of course, this extends all the way to its support for Israel and Ukraine today. So if we can't reclaim that memory, the memory of Victory Day, the memory of who actually contributed to it, of what the underlying reasons for the emergence of the Nazi regime were, then I think we laid the ground for the same crimes to be repeated again and again, except this time under the banner of democracy and freedom. And if I can end with just a short quote, I came across this quote earlier this year. I think it's a very powerful one about the soldiers of the Red Army, and if I can just find it somewhere. The quote is here. And yet, under their slovenly and anarchical appearance, it was easy to see in them, in each of those rough and open faces, the good soldiers of the Red Army, the valiant men of the old and new Russia, gentle in peace and fierce in war, strong from an inner discipline born from concord, from reciprocal love and from love of their country, a stronger discipline because it came from the spirit than the mechanical and servile discipline of the Germans. It was easy to understand, living among them, why this former discipline and not the latter had finally triumphed. And that is Primo Levi, who was an Italian prisoner at Auschwitz, who was liberated at the end of the war. So I'll end there. Thank you so much, Radhika, again.
I'm Michael Hudson. I'm appearing here for the International Manifesto Group. If you like this video and ones like it, please subscribe. For more information, go to the address on the screen.